Welcome, everybody, to today's Acronis webinar, Maximize OT Server Uptime in Factory Floor Environments. I'm your host, James Slaby, Director of Cyber Protection. I've been with Acronis for about 8 years. If you want to know more about my background as an industry analyst and product guy with various networking and cybersecurity vendors, go check out my LinkedIn profile. All right, let's have a quick look at our agenda. We're going to start off with some very brief kind of 30,000 foot level content. We've got a VIP keynote speaker who's going to give a very brief kickoff presentation. I'm going to come back with a few minutes of setup on kind of state of the OT ICS environment. But we want to get quickly through that to get to the heart of the event, which is our panel discussion. We've got some awesome industry experts. We've got someone from Verve Industrial, someone from Honeywell, my Acronis colleague, who's probably the smartest person in the company when it comes to manufacturing issues. That's going to be an extended discussion about this OT server uptime issue. This is really hopefully what you came for. After that, we're going to get a very tight, abbreviated tour of our own solution for protecting automated factory floor environments. And then I'm going to bring that incredible expert panel back to take your questions live. So keep those questions coming throughout the event. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Philipp Rösler is a valued advisor to the Acronis Board of Directors. But if you know him, it's probably as the former Vice Chancellor of Germany. And before that, it's Minister of Commerce and Technology. He's going to get us started with a very brief collection of his thoughts on the importance of agility in manufacturing. The stage is yours, Herr Rösler.
Okay, thank you, James. Ladies and gentlemen, the entire conference is focusing on approaches how to reduce significantly the OT server downtime in highly automated factory floor environments. And there are a lot of reasons to do so, because Aberdeen recently estimated the downtime costs. And in average, an hour in downtime costs $260,000. So enough reasons to act immediately and accordingly. But allow me first to put the entire topic into a global perspective. We're all using in the manufacturing more and more Industry 4.0, which means to combine automatization, IoT, OT, big data, data analytics, and AI. And there have been recent studies, for example, from the MPI research group, that around 30% of the managers are convinced that by using Industry 4.0, the profitability will increase significantly by more than 10%. However, in order to realize these bottom line gains, there's still a lot to do. Because at the same time, we see an increasing number of cyber attacks. In the recent years, we have seen an increase of 300%. The classical attacks, ransomware, virus, you name it, but at the same time, more and more new technologies on top of this. For example, ChatGPT, because unfortunately, will support existing cyber criminals, improve their skills, but at the same time, hundreds of thousands low-skilled criminals will have access due to ChatGPT to cyber attacks. So again, there's a lot to do, and on top of these risks, we still have some homework to do if we see the legacy infrastructure. For example, 30% of the people that was recently pulled out by a study from BlackBerry are still using Windows NT, which was put in place in 1993, and the last management was an update in 2004. So again, the IoT device vulnerability is also an important topic in the manufacturing business. And Acronis put all these people together, expert out of manufacturing, automatization, IoT, OT, cyber protection. So thank you to Acronis, and thank you for attending here, and best of luck for the session. And now back to you, James.
Thanks so much for that, Philip. Attendees, before I get started with my little brief setup bit, I'd like you to respond to a quick poll question. So if we can run that poll, please. What causes the most downtime for your production environment? Is it scheduled maintenance? Is it hardware failures? Is your downtime most often caused by a software issue like a Windows blue screen? I actually saw one of those recently for the first time in a while. I think it was probably my dock, not Windows. Cyber attacks or malware incidents, like a ransomware attack, God forbid, or do you not know? All right, so scheduled maintenance, no surprise there. Hardware failure at 23%. Software issues at almost exactly the same. Cyber attacks, malware at 14%. That's a little higher than I might have expected, and not good news. And then don't know fully 14%. All right, so that's interesting. A bit of quick snapshot of what you're seeing before we get into my bit. So let's start with that. All right. So I expect most of you have a pretty good idea exactly how much an hour of downtime costs on your factory floor. I imagine you probably didn't blink when Philipp quoted that statistic of something like $250,000 per hour. This, of course, is why every OT engineering staff knows they have to take every measure that they possibly can to keep those OT servers up and running, restore them quickly when they fail for whatever reason. Obviously, there are challenges to doing this. You mentioned the challenge of scheduling downtime for maintenance tasks. Backups don't always run quickly enough in the time that you have allotted. And if you've ever tried to rebuild an OT server from scratch, you know how complicated and error-prone, just in generally finicky and overlong that process is. On top of this, you probably don't have any local IT support resources. And depending on how networked your environment is, you may be exposed to a variety of cyber threats. So in general, once we've got an OT configuration working, we mostly want to leave it the heck alone. Next slide, please. So your OT servers and the robots or process controllers or whatever they're managing were built together by the vendor, installed however many years ago that was. They have their tasks, they do them well. The hardware you're probably running them on is a few years old. That model's probably not even made anymore. And as Philipp alluded to, you're probably running some antique version of Windows XP or Server 2003, Server 2008, something like that, which makes it probably too old to run most modern cybersecurity products, right? Meanwhile, Microsoft stopped issuing patches for bugs or security vulnerabilities a few years ago. Your OT vendor doesn't want you messing with the setup either. And depending on the industry you're in, you may have compliance authorities to answer to if you're making config changes that result in manufacturing process changes. Next slide, please. All right, this is kind of the area that I typically talk to IT operations staffs about, but since we're talking about OT here, I'm hopeful that you have very limited, if any, network connections into your environment, which will limit the kind of cyber threats that you're exposed to. But it's probably not uncommon for you to allow remote connections into your servers occasionally for maintenance or support purposes. You've maybe got to upgrade your OT software from time to time, so you're getting downloads from your vendor, and maybe you're storing backups in a private cloud or a public cloud somewhere. So anytime you open up a connection like that, you're exposing your environment to the kind of all the evils, the cyber threats that are around in 2003. So understand that there's always some cyber criminal gang that's just ready to pounce on an RDP connection that you haven't carefully secured into your servers, or they're always trying to compromise the software vendors. You think about like the SolarWinds attacks or similar kinds of attacks where they are breaching the vendor's distribution repository. You're downloading what looks like a trusted update, and in fact, it's bearing a malware payload. Likewise, if you're any kind of connection to your local area network or a cloud connection, you're opening up yourself to vulnerabilities that could potentially lead to a ransomware attack. Usually this is the point where I start talking about ChatGPT, generative AI in general, as cyber threat enhancers. but I really want to get to our panel here because this is the good stuff. If you're curious about this particular topic, go to acronis.events. There's a replay of a webinar I did recently where we kind of deep dive into this issue. But I promised you we would get past this higher level stuff quickly. And I want to do that, so let's keep moving. All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce my esteemed panel of experts. Rick Kahn is the VP Solutions at Verve Industrial Protection. He's got more than 20 years of experience developing security solutions in every corner of the manufacturing industry. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Great, I can hear you. My next panelist is Rick Stoff. He's the Senior Product Manager for the Experian Platform Infrastructure Group at Honeywell Process Solutions. He's worked in the process control industry for over 17 years in engineering and product management roles. Welcome, the other Rick.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Last but not least is my Acronis colleague, Ryan Davis, who has over 10 years of building storage, data management, business continuity, and cybersecurity solutions across the commercial sector with particular depth in the manufacturing industry. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, James.
All right. So guys, I work for a tech vendor, and we tend to lead with technology as the answer to every problem. But I think our audience and you all know that process and people skills are at least as important. So maybe I could start off the discussion by asking you to talk about some of the process challenges you and the manufacturing companies you're working with have in trying to keep OT servers up and running. Which of the Ricks wants to start here?
I can go first, James. Yeah,
please,
sure.
Please.
Yeah, I think probably the first step is just a recognition that OT applications have a different consideration set than IT applications do. And a common mistake that we often see is trying to treat both IT and OT with the same paintbrush. OT applications, as you mentioned, they often have tight couplings between the app, the operating system, and the hardware. And this can kind of limit the type of tools that you would traditionally use for IT management, in the OT environment, especially in air gapped environments where those tools just simply aren't accessible. And when it comes to the maintenance side too, OT applications have extended windows where patching, physical type maintenance can be done. So the traditional, evening, weekend type patching and IT environment just simply isn't there because those workloads are running 24/7. So really what it kind of comes down to is just needing tools that can secure, back up and maintain those OT workloads without interrupting the performance and, ensuring the availability of that OT application there.
That's great stuff. Rick Kahn, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I just want to make an observation, a slightly different perspective. Absolutely correct what was just said, but the other challenge that we find many OT people have is that your backup solution needs to mirror the criticality of the system. Just because it's a Windows, insert name here, doesn't necessarily mean it's critical or not to safe operations, or it might be, right? It might be an impactful system. For example, we're talking today primarily about OS backups, but there needs to be backups of DCS programming logic, ladder logic on your PLCs, et cetera. And quite often you'll find an HMI that is sort of a central repository and configuration that has all that software in there for those configurations. That device, even though it's showing a non-impactful safety system or engineering station, is almost, or if not more important, to the restoration portion. And so we find that clients are spending a lot of time in understanding not just what they have for Windows boxes, but what their operational role is and the impact to safe response, and then building their backup plan relative to the impact of the asset. So a lot more data going in than simple, spreadsheet of OSs and IP addresses. It's starting to really show a lot of benefit to these organizations.
All right. Ryan, I know you've worked with a few dozen manufacturing customers of Acronis on this. Any particular wisdom you can bring to the whole process question here?
Yeah, and my credentials next to the two Ricks in terms of automation, cybersecurity are probably not the most burnished, but we do have a lot of experience.
It's hard not to be humbled by what those guys know.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, but in my experience, one of process challenge, I'm not sure it's the best definition, but I was thinking back to what a common challenge that we see. And a lot of organizations have gotten to 2022 through following the processes how they always did things. And what that often leads to is, as the environments change, as they modernize, suddenly you've got a mix of legacy workflows, of legacy processes, and new processes. And so, if you have an organization that has a fleet of plants, or even within a given plant where they have a variety of different production lines, that can lead to organizations having different workflows, even just tied to backup and recovery for different systems, different classes of systems, or different sites. And being able to standardize as much as possible and eliminate the complexity in process is an endeavor that we encourage a lot of our companies, our partners and customers to strive towards. Because I hear customers tell me all the time, well, one guy was out of the office and he was the one that knew how this recovery workflow worked for this particular system. And so you may have an army of people that know that process for the bulk of your systems, but if you've got different workflows in different areas of your business, you're always at risk of that single point of failure. So making sure you have as much standardization and consistency as you possibly can, and then be multi-threaded for those processes is important.
Yeah, I guess it's great for career security if you're the only guy that knows what's going on until you go on holiday. All right. So we've talked about the kind of the classic troika here: people, tech, processes. We knocked down processes. Why don't we touch on challenges around uptime as they specifically relate to the technology? Rick Kahn, why don't you get us started off here?
Yeah, well, the backups are the last line of defense, right? And kind of we talked about, in security and CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Well, in OT, it's backwards, right? And so a lot is dependent upon those systems. And as I sort of mentioned the last one, different systems have different needs. We can't be backing everything up every day, full daily and a weekly offsite, because we may not have the staff. I know we're shadowing the people part next, but so technically we need to have a better understanding of what it is that we have out there, because sometimes it's redundant, and that's sort of a safety net. Sometimes it's virtualized, which sort of is a different perspective. But really, some of the things we've already talked about, we've got Windows XP and Server 2003 out there. We've got different clients. We've also got, some clients being expected to run certain technologies from different vendors. I mean, I know Acronis are quite familiar with it, but I know some of your peers are being, the standard of other OEM vendors. And so then the technology becomes much more complex for these people. And so being able to see and understand, cohesive program and understand the status of their backups across those multiple technologies it becomes a real challenge. I mean, we had a client the other day know that they've got 2 or 3 backup tools because 2 or 3 vendors. And then when something went wrong, they literally, held their breath and crossed their fingers. And they went to check, well, is that on this particular schedule or not? And did it actually run? And they breathlessly ran to the interface. And it was Acronis that actually they were running this particular system on. And they did have a backup. They saved 150 hours of regulatory compliance and documentation. And it came down to the fact that they did set up some of the automation that you offer, right, where possible we want to automate some of this technology. But just the depth and breadth of technology, whether that's the target systems or the regulatory needs and hoops to jump through and how we track that is really becoming a big deal. And so we find a global view of all assets and a global understanding of backups and criticality is what's really turning the tide, and that criticality comes to what is it technically and what is its function, and how do those tie back to the importance of recovery.
Yeah, I was thinking, we often recommend that you try to routinely test your backups, actually see if your restoral works, so that in the moment you don't have to worry whether or not it's actually going to successfully restore. It seems like that's especially challenging in these environments where scheduling downtime for that kind of thing is so hard and expensive. Rick Stoff, thoughts about the technology dimension of this particular challenge?
Sure. Yeah, and I think you touched on some of the key ones earlier, James. I mean, specifically, these environments in the OT world are using old operating systems, old hardware, and it's really, how do you support that over the life of a system? And if you have some sort of failure, how do you recover, from a computer that was built 20 years ago to running it on, technology that's available today. And what we've really seen is virtualization is really being that enabler, to help OT environments, really kind of, progress to abstract that, connection there. But when you move into the world of virtualization and the OT environment, there's a bit more conservative approach than you need to take, not just for virtualization, but any technology with OT. And, for example, an IT environment, you're trying to virtualize, just how many virtual machines can you put in that server? But in the OT world, you're much more worried about scope of loss, so, basically not putting all your eggs in one basket and looking at determinism. So having a predictable failure model where if you lose a specific hardware asset, how does that impact the rest of your OT environment there? And I would be remiss in not mentioning, cybersecurity concerns, of course, but, much like virtualization, the tools and technology that we need to implement to secure OT environments, they have to, be compatible, with those OT environments. And you can secure a system as much as you want, but if it's not usable and then it's not supporting your process, then it's not really, doing your organization any good. So there's really that balance of providing the right technology, the right security with what the operational processes are. And those are, different from customer to customer.
Ryan, as the tech representative on the panel, I imagine you have some thoughts about tech in this context.
Well, I think you're overselling me if I'm the technical representative of the panel, but
well, no, the technology vendor guy.
The vendor
right?
perspective.
We're the ones that say technology is the answer to all your problems. Even though
exactly, and
right?
Technology is a part of the answer to the problem, right? And I think Rick, hit on the idea of having a heterogeneous environment and having tools that are going to be compatible across the board. That's really, really important. And that's one area that Acronis has really emphasized, maintaining our support for those legacy platforms, because we understand you're going to have everything from the really old to the really new. And then having a platform that allows you to leverage modern technologies like migration to virtualization for any system across that spectrum. And so we provide, in my view, the best technology solution to that problem, but it has to be complemented with a process solution as well. So to Rick's point, you do have to be careful. Not all automation applications are going to be compatible with virtualization. Not all of them are going to actually work the way they did before if you take them off their original device and migrate them to a hypervisor. And so this is part of the reason that we partner so closely with organizations like Honeywell, like Verve, that offer both products, platforms, and services to provide that sort of guidance for our customers. I would love it if Acronis could tell you which automation application can be virtualized and which one it can't, but that's not our expertise. Our expertise is in the cyber protection platform and capabilities. And we have partners in the ecosystem that can help provide that further guidance for our customers to build a holistic solution.
All right, guys. So we've talked about process challenges. We've talked about technology. Let's kick around this notion of the people and skills challenges in kind of addressing this particular OT server uptime challenge. Let's say, Ryan, I've been going to you last every time. Why don't you start us off here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the people component of the challenge, I mean, it typically comes back to two different kind of vectors that I see a lot. So one is the human error component. And I had a customer the other day tell me, the biggest value that we get out of Acronis is we have people come mess stuff up all the time, whether it's our internal employees or we'll have vendors come on and they'll do a incorrect update. And if we didn't have Acronis, it would be so much more downtime, so many more hours of rebuilding those systems, right? So the human error component, that's one that with processes, perhaps you can improve, but you can't potentially eliminate, right? And so having that fallback, I think Rick used the term, it's the last resort. Having a solution that gives you confidence in your fallback capability is really, really important. And then the skills gap is something that I think the industry is starting to address. We're seeing a lot more IT-OT convergence initiatives, or even organizations within our customers that are responsible for OT cybersecurity. I always tell the joke when I started in this business and, in the early 2000s, whenever I was working with a customer that had industrial control system environments, oftentimes it was an electrical engineer that was managing these computers, not because they had any OT cybersecurity experience, but because the computers ran on electricity. And so they had electricity in their title. And I wish I was joking. That was so true. And so we've evolved a little bit since then where there's more of a focus on this space, but I think continued emphasis and investment from organizations treating this as a key function of their operations is going to be very, very important. And until then, having solutions that are easy to digest, easy to use are going to be really important, where you may have a process control engineer their core expertise is not managing IT solutions, right? They're a manufacturing expert, but providing tools that person can utilize effectively on the plant floor is going to be really, really important until the day that there's dedicated focus in all these companies around OT security.
All right, Rick Kahn, your thoughts on the people part of this triangle here?
Yeah, so it's funny. Ryan mentions the electrical guy because it's about electricity. Again, another anecdote. A few weeks ago, met a new client came on board. The board had a list of findings. They didn't have an OT security person, so our guy who's in IT literally got a new title and new business cards. He's now IT OT security, right? And so you sort of slap this onto somebody and hope that it actually makes a difference. But the reality is that there's not enough of them. Another example I have of a pipeline client. When I first started working with him a few years ago, he had 5 or 6 Windows-based systems and 2 or 3 assistants. Today, he's got 47 Windows-based systems and 1 assistant, right? And so the only caution I would give, and the thing I would point out, is that it's an increasingly complex environment with a lot of technical debt that we're just never going to get out from. We're never going to patch everything and make everything Windows 11, at least not while I'm an employed person. And so for the people, it's trying to find a way to empower what we do have, right? And so we advocate, a central view of as many assets and as many indicators as possible. I talked earlier about, we need to know if this is a critical system or not. We need to also know if I've got a recent backup before I do something to it. We've talked about restore points, but part of the process is I'm going to apply something. I better run a backup recently before I change anything so I can go back to the last known good. So where you can automate the understanding of the systems, where you can automate and report on the status of the backup and the system itself, as well as any other indicators that might help, you're sort of giving this very small headcount a running chance at potentially keeping up in front of it. So to me, it's around context of the asset and automation, because there just aren't enough bodies to be doing this frontline.
All right, Rick Stoff, the last word here on people, skills,
Sure.
kind of people that you want addressing this particular challenge.
Yeah, and just to echo Ryan and Rick, I mean, certainly the industry and the process automation industry as a whole certainly has a lack of let's say OT skill gaps. And as Ryan was mentioning, it's usually the electrician or an operations person that in managing the OT environment is a collateral duty. It's not even their day job. It's hey, it's Patch Tuesday, I better go update these boxes, right? And when we do see that IT-OT convergence, growing and being more common, it's also about how do you give that IT person the context of how to operate in the OT environment. So, there may be a specific network card, for example, or a specific way you have to reboot a server that is specific to that OT environment where, if you don't do it the right way, it could, cause a process upset. The general rule of thumb that we kind of use is if the tool is more difficult than a web browser, it's probably too complicated for the OT environment. And so when we're, looking at any of these type of skill gap challenges, and Ryan mentioned having like a recovery plan, the more successful organizations I've seen to kind of make up for those skill gaps is providing a playbook. So when something does go wrong, like, here's what we need to do, here's the resources we need to reach out to, and having drills to prepare for those types of environments, just like you would have a fire drill or any other type of physical preparation.
All right, guys. I think that was a nice examination of the kind of the big three there. I'm a cybersecurity guy. I am always hopeful that the typical OT environment I see will be somewhat shielded from cybersecurity issues by dint of limited connections to the outside world. But I think we saw from that audience poll that we did up front that cybersecurity issues are responsible for, I think it was high teens digits as a main source of outages. So I wanted to spend some time exploring this question of dealing with cybersecurity issues on the factory floor. You know, I talked about how if you're running Windows Server 2003, there probably aren't a lot of cybersecurity solutions vendors out there who can help you. You know, they stopped supporting that OS some years ago, but that's just one issue. Rick Kahn, I think you're probably a good guy to lead off the discussion on cybersecurity on the factory floor.
Yeah, I mean, talking general issues, we've always already covered, many of the typical ones. But when you talk, I think you've introduced the concept of, back to the threat vectors, right? One of the things we find in our platform approach is that we want to know everything about the endpoint, including backups, but also configuration. And one of the things that we often see, far more often than people ever are truly aware of, is we get a lot of dual home systems because people are trying to find ways around, firewalls or things that don't work to get data to other departments, whether that's mixing formulas, whether that's temperature, pressure, quality of different petrochemical products for going to market, et cetera. I mean, one of the ones doing it right, they have their pricing changes with every 30 seconds based on the stuff coming out of the actual process. But then you also have, again, and a nod to all the lack of people, the number of backdoor modems and generic sort of remote access, right? And it's funny because we go through and we have to jump through these hoops and show our birth date and our address and our security background check. But then vendor A has a generic account for people to log in and come right into the control system, right? So there's lots of gaps and problems we're seeing from many-year trend of wanting more productivity at the same amount of equipment and the same number of headcount or even less headcount. And so we talk about cybersecurity issues, they are a myriad, right? And again, with backup and restoration being sort of that safety net, what's going to push me in that system? How many different threat vectors do I have? And really, for us, it's all the unknowns that many of these clients aren't necessarily aware of. One of the first things I used to do when I go to an assessment of plant, I would open up my laptop and I would just drive around the perimeter and I would count how many Wi-Fi spots I could see. And then we went in the next day and said, so how many Wi-Fi access do you have? And the number was never the number of ones that I saw. Right. And it's always, something you don't expect. So really it's the shadow IT, people trying to solve problems and hit that mantra. I was in Aramco when they melted down for Shamoon. 37 people showed up to an OT security presentation. It wasn't because I brought really good donuts or anything, but they told me, don't worry, we've unplugged the refineries. And I said, but they're going to bring in USB keys because they have to keep the refinery. And they said, no, they know better. They know they'll be fired if they violate an IT policy. The reality is productivity is king. And we need to embrace that, and we need to be able to catalog and understand our risk, because any sort of threat vector leads to the poll results earlier that we saw.
Yeah, you can't blame people for trying to do their jobs, trying to get more efficient.
Nope. And you said it. It's a frontline electrical engineer whose job is to keep things running and keep people safe.
Yep.
Right. IT is nice to have, not a need to have in those perspectives. And that's a big difference. And that's why there's so much discussion about IT-OT convergence.
Yeah, I'm kind of reminded of the need. We talk a lot about security awareness training, and it gets only more important as the bad guys get kind of cleverer. Like I talked about ChatGPT, for instance, your typical phishing email is not going to have spelling or grammar errors anymore because the bad guys have the help of ChatGPT to make that much more convincing. But in general, everybody needs to be occasionally reminded that the cybersecurity is everyone's job, and we're not going to fire you for kind of going around policy to do your job, but you really need to be aware that it has the potential to bring everything to a grinding halt.
And actually, James, just to jump in, Rick brings up shadow IT, which is, I was going to make that point as well, right? I mean, shadow creates a lot of problems, but when you look at something like backup is often shadow IT in a lot of these organizations. It's not a standardized, consistent, it's probably not even, it is not even designed, right? So it is, hey, we should be doing backup, but I'm sure someone at the plant will be doing it. Right. And so one of the things that we've seen our customers that are most mature in this space, they bring backup and recovery out of shadow IT into a thought out, established, defined solution for their organization. And doing that in a way where you're not just forklifting whatever they're using in the data center and trying to drop it into their OT environment, where they assess their unique needs in OT and select a solution to fit that environment. That's who I see as most successful. I can't tell you how many customers that we've had that even were using Acronis for years, and Acronis was shadow IT. And so being able to establish a consistent solution and have it managed, organized, structured with intent is really, really important.
Rick, Stoff, you have some thoughts here?
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned kind of earlier, OT security is kind of always going to be a balance of protection mechanisms you have in place, the usability of the system, once you're putting in those different protections, the compatibility of that whatever tool you're using with your OT application, and then the recovery, if some sort of event were to occur. And when we're looking at these solutions that are often completely on premise and don't have, internet connectivity, some of the typical tools that you would use to recover environments, again, just, simply aren't there. So it kind of just goes back to my previous comment, is just having a plan in place to what are you going to do, if an event were to occur, so you can put all the tools that you want to secure the system, but if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework and how any sort of cybersecurity event happens, the day that the attack occurs is often, much beyond when the initial infiltration of the system, occurred, or, after all the reconnaissance that the attackers, were doing onto the system. So it's having proper recovery plans in place. Do you have immutable storage? Are you storing your backups off-site? And when you do need to recover, do you have an environment to recover to? I think there is also an assumption that has to be made that if your infrastructure is attacked, that infrastructure may not be available. There may be law enforcement engaged that's helping you to do forensics to determine where that attack occurred. The hypervisor itself may have been attacked by whatever event that you had. So it's having infrastructure in place, procedures, available, and, clean and recoverable backups to bring your system back to operation.
All right, guys, that was an awesome discussion, but we need to move on here. Wish we had another half hour for this, but let's get on to our next segment here. It's now time for a very brief tour of Acronis CyberProtect, which is the platform that Acronis's manufacturing customers use to protect their OT and ICS server uptime. Your tour guide today is Acronis Superstar Solutions Architect JD Perham. He's been with us for nearly 6 years. Most of that time he has spent helping our manufacturing industry customers build resilient, highly secure OT environments. Take it away, JD.
Thanks, James. Hey, everyone. Today we're going to go through just a small feature, one of the aspects of Acronis CyberProtect, one of the most critical features that we offer in the platform, and that's recovery. Now, with all of the platforms that Acronis offers, there's a number of different ways to go about recovery of a system or an asset that you need protected. First, we're going to start in the console. Real easy from the console, I can come underneath devices. I can find the device in question that I need to restore. If that device is online, I'll be able to see it showing here. I can then select that device, simply choose recovery on the right-hand side. That then is going to give me all of the storage locations that we have backups stored from this device. Moving forward from here, once I've got my location selected, I can come down and I can choose a point in time that I want. Now, when we're selecting the device from this screen, it's going to show us all of the backups. Even if I've got multiple plans associated with it, it's going to give me my backup plan name here. Now, what's great about Acronis is we do a lot of the work underneath the hood. So looking at, the different recovery points here, it doesn't matter if it's an incremental, a differential, or a full backup. I'm going to get the same options, as Acronis is going to go through and do all of that consolidation for you. Now, as a technician, your technician just simply needs to pick the point in time they need to restore to. Once I have that point selected, I'll get a couple of options here at the bottom. Now, starting with the simplest, right, a file level restore. I can simply come in and hit recover, choose files and folders. That's then going to take me into a browse where I can look at what's inside of the backup the exact same way I would as if I was looking through Windows File Explorer. So if I come underneath, for example, my C drive here, I can now see everything that was included inside of that backup. So if I wanted to come in and say, for example, this test restore folder, I can come in and select that, and then I can choose to recover it, or alternatively, I can download it directly right here in the browser. If I choose to recover, we're going to give you a couple of different options here, right? And it's going to create a simple recovery plan. Now, it's prompting for credentials because this backup is stored on a network share. So it's going to ask me to authenticate against that network share to make sure I have rights to do this recovery. So I'm simply going to enter in my credentials here. Once I have my credentials entered, the agent that we selected to do that recovery is then going to go through and read that backup. So a lot of this information you've been seeing up to this point has been pulled from metadata. But now that we're actually reading into the backup, it knows exactly what machine we're recovering it to. I can choose to push it back to the original location or to a custom location. Now I can come in here and I can select any of the machines that I have online. So even if the backup was, say, coming from machine A, I could take that file and push it to machine C, D. It doesn't matter, right? As long as that machine is online and I can see it here on my list. We're just going to leave it as the original machine that the backup was taken from. And then in my recovery point, let's say I needed to pull back, say, an older configuration file for a configuration check, right, to make sure that there's not been any changes there. Well, I could come through and instead of replacing it just directly back in the original location, I could come in and say, hey, let's put it into a custom location. This then allows me to browse directly on the machine, choose where I want it to restore to. Now I can come in and just say original location, and when I hit start recovery, it's going to give me a couple of options here. So I can choose to overwrite any existing files. So that's just going to say, hey, let's overwrite that. Overwrite an existing file if it is an older file, right? So if our file is looking older, we'll go ahead and overwrite that. Or I could say do not overwrite, and then we'll just automatically append a 1 to the end of it. Now, typically a restart's not going to be needed with a file level restore unless you're doing a file that's coming from the operating system. So you could simply deselect that, hit proceed. That is then going to start that recovery task. The same type of operation would be available with an entire machine recovery, right? So if I wanted to come in and say, hey, let's go through and do a file level or a full system restore, as long as that machine is up and running, we can do it directly right here. And we can see that that task of that file level restore completed, right? There's not a lot inside of that folder. Very little data inside of there, so it went very quick. But going back to recovering an entire machine, right? So this is going to be your more common type scenario. A bad Windows update came up, right? Someone misconfigured something or an application is acting oddly or not working correctly, right? Well, then that situation, I can simply come in and say, let's recover the entire machine. Very simple process, almost exactly the same as what I was doing with the file level restore, where I can go through and choose what am I recovering it to. So in this case, it's a physical machine. I'm going back to that same exact machine. It's going through and doing my disk mapping. So we're doing a disk-based restore in this type of scenario. But so that's going to take everything that's on disk 1 and restore it right back to that disk. If I had multiple disks inside of here, I would see them each mapped outside of here. Now, let's say I just wanted, maybe I didn't want to restore the MBR, I didn't want to restore, the system reserve. Well, I can come in here and say, let's swap to volume mapping. That's then going to change how we're doing restore. So instead of looking at the individual disk that's inside of the backup that you're seeing here on the left, this is going to change momentarily and actually show me those individual volumes. So I'll see the system reserved, NTFS, the machine is going to reserve the MBR and all of that type of information inside of here. And I can come through and change this. So if I need to do a recovery and shrink the volume down, right, I can come in here, hit change. And it's going to tell me that, hey, I can't do anything with that right now. Most folks, that's a very unique kind of recovery type situation. So we're going to keep it just to disk mapping. Now, once I'm done with all of this mapping and I can come in and hit done, and again, as we saw, it kind of mapped everything out for me, I can just simply come in and hit start recovery. Now, there's this option here you may be asking what it's for, safe recovery. That is our capability of going through and scanning the backup before we restore it to the machine for malware. So we're going to use our signature-based engine, look at all of the different files and folders that are on that machine and look for any indications of ransomware, malware, but things that you don't want on the disk. Now, certain volumes won't be able to be scanned, right? It needs to be NTFS types of scenario. But if I hover over that, it's going to tell me, hey, it's going to be scanned. Anything will be deleted after the recovery. So we scan the backup, we do the restore, and then as a post-restore step, we automatically go through and pull all those pieces off. Now, this machine is actually up and running in production, so I'm not going to do a full system state restore on it, but I'm going to go ahead and close out of that. There's two more options that we want to talk about from a recovery standpoint. There's this run as a VM. That's using our universal restore technology to take that backup file and mount it to an ESXi or Hyper-V host. Most folks are calling this kind of a digital twin, right? We can take something that's existing from your enterprise or from your operation, take an exact copy of that, and spin it up. Now, that VM could be used for a variety of different needs, whether it be, vulnerability assessments, security assessments, testing, patching, testing updates. Maybe I've got a system that's down and I'm waiting for hardware and I want to get this machine back up and running on a VM temporarily. All of that falls underneath this run as a VM. Now, you can do what we call a finalize. That's where we go through and finalize, migrate from running off of the backup into a full VM. Or if you're just done with testing, for example, you could go through and just delete that VM after it's finished. Now, this is just one option of a restore back into a virtual type environment. If I was to go back into that machine recovery, underneath that drop down where I had it stating I was going back to a physical machine, I could absolutely go and change that to a virtual machine and just not worry about mounting the backup or running from the backup, right? I can stream the data directly into a brand new VM. Now, all of this is assuming that we've got an online system, right? Now, what happens if I've got a machine that's gone offline? Hard drive fails, power supply shorts out, and I need to get that machine back up and running, right? Because it's costing us money having it down. Well, in this type of scenario, that's where we have what we call our Acronis rescue media or our bootable media. Now, this can be created ahead of time. This allows you to have a universal disk that you can then pull in a new hard drive, swap out the hard drive. You don't even have to install Windows. Throw the USB or CD inside of it and allow it to do a restore. The other option, right, is we can pixie boot this. Media can be created at any time. If I hit the head icon here at the top and I come underneath downloads, at the very bottom here, we've got our bootable media. This one is a recovery only style media. You can pre-create these as well. That's just as simple as what we were seeing inside of the console here. So I've got a virtual machine here that's booted from our boot media. I can simply come in and say recover. Once I select into recover, then I'm going to choose what data do I want to restore. So that's where I'm choosing what backup I want to pull it from. In this case, again, all of my backups are located on network share. Now, I will say I cheated a little bit and loaded this backup or this network share up ahead of time. So it's not prompting for credentials any longer, but normally on your first boot, it would. In this case, I'm just pointing to an IP address. I can come in and select COP. That's where our backups are stored in this environment. Hit OK on that. And that's going to give me a list of all the different backups that are inside of here. Now I can come in and find the specific machine that I want to do the restore of. So for example, I have a workstation machine here. If I open this guy up, here's a list of all the backups. So I can see in this case, this last backup was made, it's a little bit of an older backup, but I want to restore it. Just like it before, we have the option of doing volumes or disks. For this example, I'm going to go ahead and hit disks. I can hit OK. Select the disks itself. Hit OK here on the bottom right. Again, it's going to map what's in the backup to what's on the machine. And if I wanted to get a restore going, I can simply hit OK. So in about 4 clicks with a USB stick, I can get a technician up and running. Now, we also have ways of automating this, right? Don't have it set up in this environment, but we have some options called the Acronis Startup Recovery Manager. That's where we hide this boot media on the disk itself. And as part of that, we can do something called one-click recovery, which is where we pre-script restores. So that way users can go through and just press 2 clicks, 1 click, get the machine back up and running, right, without having to know processes or passwords, things of that nature. Now, looking at this, I can come in and see the progress running here. This is going to take a few minutes to restore because it is pulling it over the network. But that gives you just a little bit of a taste of what our recovery options look like here with Acronis through either our Acronis CyberProtect version 15 or even our Acronis CyberProtect Cloud, depending on what environment you're looking at. And with that, James, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thanks for that so much, JD. Audience, JD's doing double duty today. Aside from doing that demo, he's been keeping an eye on your questions for me. Speaking of which, it's time to get to our live Q&A. So please come back, Rick, Ryan, and Rick, so we can take some live questions from our audience. What are some of the key lessons learned from real-world OT disasters, and how can we take those lessons and apply them to our own incident response plans? Rick Stoff, why don't you take a shot at this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think kind of highlighted earlier, what we've seen is, for the most mature and successful companies is just having a plan in place, so, knowing where your backups are, knowing who is going to do those backups, knowing what steps are required to get those OT applications back online. Last thing you want at 2 a.m. is to be, wondering what drawer you put in, the hard drive or tape or, whatever it is. So, just being aware that in treating a disaster event like this, just like you would any other physical disaster.
Who else wants to chime in on this one?
I just add a little context. I mean, Rick's absolutely right. You need to have a plan, know who's in charge, et cetera. And I think that's a big challenge for many organizations, especially when you get into blended services and products. What I mean by that is a large refinery often has what's called a lab information management system, which has sample sizes and colors and flavors and parameters around the asset. Some people from the tank farm need to know volume of production so they can figure out if they have storage or not, or try to sell things. But those are commonly multi-use platforms that no one team owns, right? And we found that those sorts of oversights and gaps cause, like, everybody's thinking everybody else is worrying about it and taking care of it. We did an assessment and found one of these very critical systems that fed probably 6 different departments. No one team was responsible until the backup had failed or stopped working or whatever. And it was full of administrative accounts and stuff like it. Just these the devil's in the details. To just jump on to add on to Rick's answer, that yes, absolutely, you need to know who owns what and where and when and how, but that starts from a very comprehensive and contextual inventory. We can't just have a list of IPs and tick the box that they're backed up. A little more work, a little more rolling up the sleeves and figuring out what we have in there, who owns it, and how they're configured allows us to be much more successful in things like this.
Yeah, there's an old saw in incident response that if you got a list of key contacts, don't keep it on the network in case the network goes down. Print that stuff out. All right. Let's move on here. We've only got a few minutes for a handful of questions here. Our cyber insurance costs are going up and our coverage is shrinking. This is an issue I deal with all the time at Acronis here. Will any of the measures that you've talked about help us there? So this is an interesting angle here, is getting the insurance industry to cover you in the event of an outage. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just jump in quick. I just did a presentation at the CS4 in Canada
nice.
just 2 weeks ago on insurance. So many of our clients are coming to us saying insurances premiums have doubled and the coverage is halved. And really, if you look at what they're being required, it's some of the basic building blocks of an OT security program. Is, do I know what I have? Do I understand the vulnerabilities and risks to it? And by the way, do I know what I have? What is it? Is it important or not? And do I have a way of restoring and protecting that device, right? And so absolutely, what we're seeing is that it is being required more and more. Now, what I'm going to stop short of, because I've yet to get confirmation, because we get a lot of insurance companies phone us as well and say, we have these needs and our clients have these needs. I have no idea where to start. Can we go these jointly? What I have not heard yet, what they haven't given me a straight answer yet, is if you do these things, will the premiums go back down? So they're hesitant, but they certainly won't stay down if you don't do these sorts of things, right? So absolutely, it's a fundamental building block of anything for safe operations. And if insurance is tied to you having a pedigree around maintaining safe and expected operations, then yes, this does help to achieve those needs and demonstrate to those insurers that you're doing the right things by your investors and your fellow employees.
Yeah, I just think having a documented incident response plan is one of those kind of new requirements that came up that serves double duty here. You prepare for disaster and qualify for better insurance at lower premiums. All right, I've got a question that warms the cockles of my heart as someone who works for a company that's been in data protection for 20 years, which is, can the panel talk about the future of tape as a backup medium in factory environments? Where does backup to tape fit in the broader scheme of things and going forward?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, we still see many organizations using tape as their primary offsite backup storage medium. I mean, when you look at a lot of these OT environments, it could be some offshore platform, in the North Sea, or some refinery in a really remote area. having a WAN connection to just transfer terabytes of data just isn't something that's practical for those uses. So tape hasn't died yet. It doesn't look like it's going to die anytime soon. And so a support for tape medium, or maybe as other storage platforms progress, is something that we see, and certainly don't see a complete movement over to cloud-based backup storage at this time.
Yeah, and I would echo what Rick said with a little twist, in the sense that as Industry 4.0, which is just buzzword catch-all, but as we're starting to see more smart factories, we're starting to see more interconnectivity in manufacturing environments, we're starting to see more of an acceptance towards cloud as some sort of component of the overall stack, whether that's as a backup repository or other SaaS solutions. So I think you're going to see in a lot of use cases tape being used less, but to Rick's point, there's areas that it's not going to go away, right? As a software vendor, I'm sure we would love if tape would finally go the way of the dinosaurs, but if you're talking back to the mainland via microwaves, it's a little hard to replicate your archives that way. But again, as cloud services in general become more regularly accepted in OT environments, and there's security policies that allow for the use of cloud technologies, I think you're going to start seeing cloud be more as an accepted offsite backup repository than you do today.
All right, we're running out of time here. I wanted to get to another question I like here. It's like, you polled the audience on their biggest sources of downtime. What does the panel consider to be the biggest threat to OT environments today? Anybody?
It's always going to be human error, intentional or otherwise. Cyber incidents sometimes are inadvertently introduced by people. I'm surprised such a high number said it was a cyber incident. The don't know usually is the bigger one, because in OT, something happens, maybe we want to grab forensics, maybe we want to figure out, or maybe we want to get back to normal operations, right? And so usually it's a quick restore and rebuild, and that's ingrained in everybody. So to me, the single biggest threat is humans, whether it's forgetting to check the backup, forgetting to set the flags that we saw from JD showing us the different features and capabilities. I mean, why not leverage those things? Understanding the right systems, like I said, the LIMS system not being backed up, it's almost always human error, to be honest, whether again intentional or otherwise, in my opinion.
I think one of the areas that I think is a big risk is just understanding what OT components you have in your environment. So, having a full asset inventory, no system is, common to one specific OT provider. I mean, they're blended environments. There might be an environmental system talking to a distributed control system, and knowing which types of platforms, what type of operating systems, et cetera, are used on those is just something that a lot of organizations don't have insight into. And we see certainly a lot of movement for customers wanting to move that direction.
Yeah. And just to kind of tie off, I think from my perspective, the singular largest cause is probably not that important. It's that if you look at the poll question, there was a variety of causes. There was a high number of cyber, high number of human error, high number of software like corruption. We didn't even get more granular, like a hard drive just fails. That happens all the time, right? And so having a strategy and having a response plan that can address a variety of those circumstances, whether it's a cyber event, whether it's regular hard drive failure, whether you have a widespread incident like Colonial Pipeline that affects a large percentage of your systems, right? Having a solution, having the processes, having the people trained, people process technology, having all that in place to be able to address all of those scenarios, to me, is what's most important.
All right, guys, I'm afraid we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to have to say that's all the time we have for questions. Attendees, apologies if we didn't get to your specific question, but we'll follow up with you afterwards if we didn't. So let me say a final thank you to my panelists, Rick Stoff of Honeywell, Rick Kahn of Verve Industrial, and Ryan Davis of Acronis. Also like to thank JD Perham of Acronis and Acronis board advisor, Philipp Rösler. All right, very quick wrap up here. So we have a brand new page on Acronis.com that's dedicated to our solutions for the manufacturing industry. Go check that out. We've also dropped a link in the chat for you, I think. Also encourage you to visit our resource center. We've got hundreds of white papers, ebooks, case studies, and other helpful documents that you can download for free. I just put 4 of them up on this slide here that are case studies from Acronis manufacturing industry customers from all over the world and from a few different industries: Tata Steel, ABB, Johnson Electric, and BDR Pharma. Finally, I'd like to say, if you've got the means and the inclination, please support the Acronis Cyber Foundation. You may have seen our pre-show video on this. This is our nonprofit arm that builds schools and provides training, particularly technology training, to kids all over the world in places where their resources for that are scarce. Your contributions really go far in those areas of the world. So if you can, please support that. In closing, I'll just say thanks everybody for taking an hour out of your day to be with us today. Be safe, be secure, be well. We hope to see you again at another Acronis event soon.